sponsoring this event. But I want to personally thank Theresa and Benjamin for agreeing to be part of this important initiative, which is part of a larger initiative that BC is sponsoring on race and racism. So Ruth, it's your show whenever you want to begin.
Yeah, well, we should start or give people a few more minutes to come on. Susie, did you discover the list of who we're expecting?
There should be about 16.
Okay, so we're still at 10. Give it 2 minutes and then we'll start.
I've always heard that in the world of theater, 5 minutes after start time is actual start time.
In New York, it's 7 minutes, actually.
I thought it was 7 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, Broadway shows start 7 minutes after the hour.
Yeah, and then that's on time. So people say, why isn't the show started? I'm like, that's on time.
Yeah.
Eric, I love your background.
Thanks. I was working on stuff. I'm in my office at BC, but I over the summer and spring, I was doing tons of informational stuff for parents and applicants and whatever. I wanted something that was quasi-official. So I just took this stock image of that BC has and cropped it a little bit. It works pretty well. It's not as impressive as your library, but it at least hides the mess behind me. So so that's positive. I loved your study there. Do you guys both have desks together in the same room?
No, my husband has a bigger room.
Wow.
In fact, he actually put stacks in.
I rented when I was on sabbatical in 87, 88. I rented from Yehuda and Shula Reinhardt, and they each had a full big bedroom that was their office.
Yeah, well, this is the basement of the house.
Oh.
The advantage of these ranch houses that they built all over Newton in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
That it has.
Eric, is your son at Boston Latin in person, or is this remote?
He is remote fully right now, and the whole system was supposed to start bringing kids into a hybrid slowly from kindergarten up to the high school. He's in 10th grade, and they've delayed the beginning, so I don't know whether that'll be delayed. He's supposed to start in mid-November, but even then, the way that they've set it up, the teachers are saying that they won't move classrooms. So students will go into a homeroom and sit there for 8 hours and just Zoom from their homeroom. They won't even move classrooms. So I don't know. I mean, he's eager to get there to see friends and stuff, but I don't even know if he'll do that. If it involves an hour commute each way on the train, and then they sit there with the windows open in the middle of winter and don't leave the classroom and Zoom with headphones on. It's not great. So it's so far it doesn't sound awesome.
No, it doesn't sound awesome.
Been a bit
with
of
the understatement
struggle.
of the afternoon, but the afternoon's young.
Yeah. I'm hoping that those conditions might change, but they're strong. The teachers unions have been very firm, and everybody wants their kids to be safe, and it's just not a great setup with an old school with lots of kids in it. Unlike here where we spread out across 30 buildings and whatever, they're stuck in one place. So,
yeah. I think we're only expecting one more person at this point. So let's get started. So welcome formally now to the second session of 3, with the third one being next Tuesday, on religious resources for combating racism. Sponsored by the Center for Christian Jewish Learning and the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life for faculty. This is going to be recorded so that the discussion that we have is something that more people can benefit from as we move forward. There are people who wanted to be able to come but had conflicts. And today's specific focus, we gave it the title of Understanding the Other's Reality, Narrative Empathy, Reconciliation, and Racism. I think I know or have met most of you at this point, but I'm Ruth Langer. I am the interim director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. And joining us here is Mark Massa, who can give a wave with this. He's setting an example by eating lunch, which you all are welcome to be doing. He's the director of the Boise Center. And we have joining us today 2 panelists, one from inside BC, one from outside BC. From outside BC, we have Rabbi Dr. Benjamin Samuels, who's the rabbi of Congregation Shaarei Tefillah in Newton Center, which is about very close to Newton campus. It is the congregation to which I belong. Benji earned his rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University. He holds a PhD in Science, Philosophy, and Religion from Boston University, an MA in Biblical Studies and Medieval Jewish History, and a BA in English Literature from Yeshiva University. He teaches widely in the greater Boston Jewish community, is a much beloved teacher. And he's been working with the congregation to place issues of racism on the agenda and consciousness of our mostly, but not entirely, white community. Joining us also from, I want to say across the street, but I'm actually at home too, so it's not across the street. This is the School of Theology and Ministry, is Theresa O'Keefe, who is Associate Professor of the Practice of Youth and Young Adult Faith in the School of Theology and Ministry, where she also leads the contextual education program in which students use field opportunities to develop their praxis. And she has spent many years working in Catholic parishes, schools, and dioceses, and has published a book, Navigating Toward Adulthood, A Theology of Ministry with Adolescents. She and I got to know each other while she was working on her doctorate, which was actually an exercise in understanding Jewish and Christian adult dialogue at the congregational level. So she's crossing lots of different dimensions in terms of being able to come in and contribute to our conversation today.
And as the former dean of Theresa School, just let me say she's a much beloved figure and has a suspiciously high reputation among all the students there. So I reminded her of that.
So I want to just start off, I'm drawing some questions that will start us off based on the conversation that Benjamin and Theresa and I had a week ago, where lots and lots of energy was flowing, and we hope to recreate that and bring you all into it. So let's start off with the question of how do we as religious practitioners, students, and teachers come to understand the reality of the other? We named in our title for today, Narrative, Empathy, and Reconciliation, and how these apply to our topic of racism. So what kinds of tools do we have for this?
Theresa, would you like to go first? Would you like me to speak?
You can start us off, Benjamin. Thanks.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to meet you. I know just a couple of you, but it's great to make your acquaintance for the first time. Before I begin speaking, I just want to explain something that Ruth referenced before. Our synagogue has had a racial justice and equity committee for about 2 years now. So we were a little ahead of the curve, so to speak, of the national consciousness of this issue. But at the same time, I'd like to freely admit that our entree into being concerned about this topic, despite the title of our committee, which is Racial Justice and Equity, was really the lens of inclusivity rather than the lens of justice. And I think that, you know, post George Floyd, it became emphasized that this is really a justice issue. And so even though we had a racial justice and equity committee meeting, and some people on the committee fully understood that term, most of us were really talking about how do we maximize our welcomingness, how do we make sure everyone feels you know, included, and it was really an extension of our inclusivity rather than an obligation to right all of the wrongs that may undergird systemic racism in our country and in our world, and perhaps even in our tradition. You know, I think there's a big learning curve here, and we're all on it. Okay, you know, I want to begin with a story at my expense. I had a study partner in Israel when I was a student of advanced Talmud post-high school at what we call a yeshiva, a rabbinical academy. We weren't on the track to become rabbis, but we literally spent 15 hours a day in a very boisterous library type of space called a Beit Midrash, a study hall. And we would study Talmud, and it was an extraordinary spiritual and intellectual experience. Despite the fact, at least for one of my years there, we studied real estate law most of the time. So we could talk about Jewish study another time. But I had an Israeli study partner for part of the day, and he had some difficult times in military conflict in the Israeli army. And I went back to college, and I took a course called The War Novel as part of my BA in English literature. And after I finished that course, I was presumptuous, naive, and perhaps even indulgently arrogant enough to write my dear friend a letter telling him that now I have a little more understanding. Actually, I probably didn't say a little more. Now I understand what he went through that he alluded to in our meetings, because I read, 12 books on war throughout the past 2 centuries, and now I could relate to what he experienced in person and all of the conflicts that he experienced of being engaged in a military. And I have to tell you, I lost a friend. He was very upset at me. It was very hurtful to him. And so part of the challenge that I find in what we're calling narrative empathy is, I could speak on behalf of the Jewish tradition. You could see, if you come from a different tradition, whether this resonates with you. But we really try for radical empathy. First of all, we try to understand God's mind for those of us who are theists, and you can't get more theologically imaginative and radically empathetic than trying to understand God. And part of our theology is that God is radically empathetic and trying to understand us. So, there is a basis for radical empathy theologically in the Jewish tradition, and you'll decide whether that speaks to your tradition. And there are resources that, we can speak about in the Jewish tradition that try to cultivate and educate towards that radical empathy. And some of that is portrayed through what we're calling narrative empathy. And yet, at the same time, there's a limit to that. So I think one of the things that I just like to raise the question and struggle with is, how do we use imagining the other to understand them, but yet not trespassing the boundary of saying we know what it feels like, right? And the other side of that coin is, how do we have the license as part of an exercise in the humanities and the divinities to try to imagine another person's experience, even write about another person's experience through that imaginative empathy, without, trespassing cultural misappropriation or arrogance. So I personally am very much struggling with utilizing the resources and the educational techniques that are part of narrative empathy, reconciliation, as they relate to issues of race, and at the same time, the checks and balances that have to be part of that process.
Mm-hmm. Benjamin, thanks for starting there. And one of the things that grabs my attention there is the idea of trying to imagine the mind of God. And that immediately put me in mind of the necessary caveat that happens in that of presuming that what I like is what God is saying, so the self-deluding capacity of even the most spiritually grounded person is that God is saying the things that I think are the right things to say. And so the necessary checks against that are a part of the process. And so one of the things that I think is important is is figuring out, how do I kind of institutionalize those checks against my own delusion. And I believe the important piece of that is not only doing my own homework on an issue or a topic, like you did with reading all those books that you read, but then, in a sense, checking with the other who's close at hand, or as many others as you have the opportunity to do, and say, am I on the right track? Can you tell me about this from your own perspective? Because I hear a couple of things in that is that I need to ground my understanding well, but I shouldn't necessarily burden the other with being the teacher all the time, you know? So to say to your friend, tell me all about it because I know nothing, is something you can do sometimes, but I appreciate the work that a lot of certainly African Americans are saying to white Americans: do your homework, do your work. This isn't our job to do for you. And so I'm seeing for myself the need for me to, yes, to do my reading, learn the history, learn the sources, but never to think that that's sufficient, and where appropriate and where available to ask, kind of create relationships where I can be a trusted interlocutor, so I can check and see how does this actually land in the lives of real people. So I think it's neither one nor the other. It has to be some kind of balanced effort. One thing I've come to appreciate is that the reading gives me a whole different framework for listening that perhaps wouldn't have been there previously. Previously, I would have listened too much from my own location and tried to fit ideas, things I heard within pre-organized classifications. But the combination of my own study and the engagement with the other in a more immediate way creates frameworks, and then fills those frameworks in a different way than previously possible. Yeah. Which then actually connects to the second, the narrative empathy, which I hope we flesh out some more. That was Benjamin's contribution to the title, and mine was reconciliation, saying at the heart of the Christian tradition is reconciliation, whether we like it or not. And for me, that becomes really important, not because I want people to make nice, but I realize that in order to move forward to life, whatever that life may be, we actually have to create this space that makes it possible for people to acknowledge error and correct from it. And we're currently living in a culture in many ways that says, I'm never wrong. I can't admit to be wrong. And that, as I've likened it to in other settings, I've said, it's like having a car that can't go into reverse. You know, that you're just stuck. You just get stuck in a spot, and you're like, all you can do is keep barreling forward through brick walls, through people, through whatever. And it's like, no, we need to be able to we need to find ways, create spaces that allow people to back up so that they can then redirect. Otherwise, we're only going to do more injury. So, Ruth, you're talking, but you're on mute.
I went on mute because the phone rang.
Yeah.
So let's play with that image of the car that can't go into reverse. And what resources do our traditions bring us to help us to figure out either how to shift gears or to get the gear to work, or so let's go back to Benjamin, and we'll
Okay, well, I'll teach very briefly two Jewish sources. So the first has to do with what we call the mitzvah, or the biblical obligation, the divine mandate, to bring first fruits to the temple and express thanksgiving to God. This is adumbrated in Deuteronomy 27, and a farmer, puts a little rubber band, so to speak, on the first sprouting fruit. And then when the harvest comes in, you go back to those first fruits and those become a representation of the deep gratitude you feel for the bounty, and you bring that to Jerusalem. And there's two parts, right? There's bringing the first fruits as an offering at the temple, and then there's a recitation where you actually, in short form, just a few verses in Deuteronomy, you rehearse the entirety of the story of the Jewish people, from the patriarchal narratives through the enslavement and liberation from Egypt to the arrival at the land of promise. And there's a debate in the Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud, about whether a convert who was born a Gentile and by choice converts to Judaism is allowed to make the recitation, because the recitation says that God brought our fathers to this land. Can someone whose biological fathers did not bring them to this land, but who identifies with the people who makes that statement, make that recitation, or is it a false recitation? Now, this is very different, it should be said, than someone like me who reads a novel, giving me insight into someone else's experience, when at the end of the day, I don't live that other experience, right? A convert's making a lifelong commitment to live a different experience and assume a completely different identity. But there's a debate in the Talmud. And so the primary opinion is that a convert may not say that recitation. And according to all of the rules of adjudication of the law, you would think that that would be the final conclusion, that a convert may not say, and here I bring these first fruits, and this is the story of my fathers and my mothers and my story. But there's an alternate opinion that is brought in the commentary in the Talmud on this earlier stratum of the Talmud, and asserts that no, a convert may say it, and that was accepted as the normative law. And there's two things I want to share with this. The first is that in the wonderful tradition of the Talmud is a multivocal text. It doesn't just give conclusions like a codification, it's a repository of opinion. And the truth often inheres in the dialectical tension between different voices rather than in one particular conclusion. So I think that's a kind of a humbling affirmation. But this is just an example for me of kind of when you get to identify with someone else and how far that goes. Now, another example of that is also brought in the Mishnah and has to do with the night of Passover, when we tell the narrative of the Exodus. And the rabbis say that one is obligated to see oneself as if we ourselves came out of Egypt. And the purpose of the retelling of the Exodus is to achieve that radical empathy, where it's our story, not the story of our ancient ancestors, or not the story of the ancestors of perhaps a people to whom we have attached ourselves, but it is our story. And there's even one opinion that recognizes the challenge of that and says, no, the obligation is not to see yourself, but to show yourself as if you came out of Egypt, right? So you ritualize the performance, both verbally through the narrative and possibly even dramatically, of assuming the persona of a slave and finding your way to liberation. Some of you may be familiar with the famous philosopher of religion, Mircea Eliade, who speaks about eternal recurrence, right? That many religious traditions have these performative and performative utterance to reenact, eternally, as if we're in the moment. So, again, I don't want to be presumptuous to speak about different traditions. I could speak about the Jewish tradition with a tiny bit of insider knowledge and authority. But I do believe religious traditions do kind of undergird this idea of narrative empathy and radical empathy, and trying to imagine the other, if not actually assume the persona of the other. And yet there's another voice that says, don't fool yourself. Don't assert that too strongly. You still have a lot to learn, and don't claim for yourself something that you might not have a full claim over. And again, I'm still struggling with, the questions that I began with at the beginning. And I want to switch to hear what Theresa, and perhaps we'll open it up at some point to everyone else. But, when we started our racial justice and equity meeting at the synagogue, committee at the synagogue, as Ruth said before, we are predominantly what I would call a white space. We do not have people who would identify either as black or brown, and even the brown amongst us, and I'm not making an accusation, just in terms of people who may not be ethnically Caucasian, themselves probably identify, and I don't want to be presumptuous, with the larger dominant white space. And without getting into the question whether Jews are whites or Jews aren't whites, which is an internal Jewish conversation that sometimes happens when we get into the jargon, right? What I didn't want to happen was, many predominantly white Jews living in an affluent Boston suburb patting themselves on the back and say, look how, progressive we are because we're undertaking these issues. And yet, at the same time, how could we not undertake these issues? So that's part of the humility and the arrogance of the moment as well. And I don't know a way past that, but I know that standing silent and sitting it out on the sidelines is also not an option.
So what I'm hearing in you and your hesitancy is your hesitancy to align, or not align, that's not the right word. When it comes to this issue in the United States at this time, what's the foundation of the hesitancy?
Right. So I would identify myself as an ally to and a partner, to racial justice and equity efforts. But again, there's that question of what resources do we use to achieve that empathy, and how do we make sure that it's real and contributory and a real partnership and an alliance, and I don't dispute my intentions or anyone else's intentions, but not self-indulgent of making ourselves feel good and not having to deal with the challenges or the consequences.
Right. Okay. Yeah, part of when Ruth asked the question, I was saying, what is it that would or should or impels this Christian to face this issue with any sense of concern? And one of the ones that I spoke to, but it was actually secondary, was the centrality of reconciliation. The one that was more primary was the belief I hold as a Catholic Christian in the incarnation, that the belief that the divine is made present in the person of Jesus Christ, and by that then somehow the divine is made present and revelatory in all human persons. And so it's then incumbent on the human person, from my perspective as a Catholic Christian, to attend to the lives of real humans, to discover how in fact may God be revealing God's self in human life, through human life. And I shared with you the a chapter from Sean Copeland's book, In Fleshing Freedom, which I'm kind of embarrassed to say I actually only read relatively recently. I was saying, it's about time I read this book, and I've had it, and I should read it. And my gosh, not only to read it, I added it to the syllabus for my course that I'm teaching this semester. Why? Because it pushed me to think about incarnation very differently, and pushed me to think about African-American experiences very differently than I had previously, and to think about the life, death, and resurrection of the person of Jesus very differently. The way that Sean throughout the book aligns the experience of Jesus, the real lived experience of Jesus as a man living in a subjugated world under Roman occupation, in a world that focused on the benefit of the Roman Empire, and how in many, many ways is Jesus' life reflective of the life of a person whose life was designed for the benefit of the empire. And then reading the experience of slavery in light of that. And I found that very eye-opening for myself, heart-opening for myself. And I was thinking very recently, about how my attention to racism, which while it's always been that sympathy, it's actually never been deeply informed, I'll admit now. I've been pushed recently to do more work and realize that my views on racism are similar to the changing views I had on feminism years ago when I did my master's study. When I thought feminism, yes, that's like, why should we should be concerned about the lives of women, but then to realize kind of literally a reframing that happened in my mind, that it wasn't women who got to kind of work their way into the edge of the frame for some consideration now and again. It was a reframing of my ideas about what it meant to be human by putting men and women equally in the center of the frame, which then very seriously raised new considerations about what do we think does it mean to be human when we include women equally in the center of the frame with men. So in this experience now, what I'm being pushed to do is put African Americans and all non-whites in the center of the frame. Of course, the frame gets a lot more crowded, but it makes me seriously consider how has their life been categorized in a variety of ways to be pushed out of the frame, historically, systemically, and how those things are ongoing, and what impact has it done on the lives of individuals and of communities of people historically to bring them to the places that they are now, and not only African Americans or Asians or Hispanics or whomever, but also what has that done to whites? How have we all suffered from systems that have been set up to benefit whites in particular, and others kind of incrementally in varying stratus of benefit. So it's really been, for me, a challenging reconception that now has me thinking about the world in general, history in particular, and public policy in particular, in very different kinds of ways, and even church policy, which is a place where I live. So I work in the School of Theology and Ministry. I'm preparing people for ministry in a variety of settings, particularly in the Catholic Church. And how does that help me rethink even the way the church functions, who it's listening to, who it sidelines historically and currently.
Yeah, can I respond, Ruth, to something that went through my, so Theresa, thank you so much for that wonderful articulation. What resonated with me as I'm listening to you and hearing what you have to teach me and all of us, and I thank you for that, as well as, kind of by compulsion of my own worldview of trying to see it through the lens of how I'm breaking down things. I'm hearing again the tension between what I began with, the frame of inclusivity and the frame of justice, because you spoke about incarnation kind of as a lens through which to understand the revelation that may be inherent in others. I'm not sure that the concepts track stepwise, but in the Jewish tradition, this may or may not be present in the Christian tradition too. We speak about Tselem Elokim, the image of God, the image of God of every individual, and that's really the inclusive message, right? That everyone has fundamental equality, absolute worth, and the dignity of uniqueness, right? So everyone, right? But none of us want to stand up and say all lives matter. Because even though there's truth in that statement, all lives matter, all lives have the Tselem Elokim, right? When someone says all lives matter, a person who wants to say Black lives matter is saying, yeah, but you don't get it, right? Because in the justice frame, until Black lives matter, all lives do not matter. certainly not equally without a recognition of that uniqueness and that absolute worth of every individual. So, you know, I think our traditions are robust in the inclusivity frame, or should be robust in the inclusivity frame, and there are enough ethical resources to advance the justice frame, but that's where you know, how, in reconciliation, is there a difference between kind of the reorientation between moving beyond the inclusivity frame to a real justice frame, and what does reconciliation then demand of us and require to achieve that goal? I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Why don't we open this?
But yeah, let's invite more voices in.
To those who've joined us, and Janet, did you look like you wanted to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been struggling with the same things that Benji's talking about with. I couldn't put it in those words. Yeah, I'd be interested, Theresa, in you answering that question that he just asked. I mean, what does reconciliation require of us? And I guess also, when you guys talked about reconciliation and talked about, even Benji, when you talked about, you know, not being able to really know everything, you know, that radical empathy, you know, doesn't really bring us all the way. I started thinking about the cancel culture and how, you know, how you guys are just talking about cancel culture. No, you know, that's not the way to do it. We have to give people room for growing. And so I mean, I'm really interested in this growing. Where do we have to grow to? I'm reading. Yeah, I don't know.
I would say that it's not there's not a singular answer to that. Even in a
Right.
given incident, it's not as if everybody's equal in that exchange. So what does reconciliation require of us? If I'm the injured party, well, first of all, requires some degree of courage that I even call for someone to reconcile. It also calls further vulnerability from me, and so it's not necessarily always appropriate for me to be present for the reconciling, in a sense. There is a great degree of, I think you used the word growth in there somewhere, Janet. I think on the person who has done the harm, first of all, they have to recognize they've done the harm, and which itself is a growth experience. And they may not want to do that. That's requiring for them humility, which also implies within it some vulnerability to admit one that needs to be humble, puts oneself in a place of vulnerability. And not everybody wants to go there. In fact, I don't know very many people who choose it voluntarily. But one of the challenges, and I don't know much about cancel culture, but one of the things I appreciate about it is trying to say that person is wrong. We have to kind of separate ourselves from them. They are doing harm. And so if a person is continuing to do harm, in a sense, yes, separate yourself. You have to actually get to a place where you're no longer being harmed, okay? On the other hand, if that person then is ostracized from the community at large, they have no choice, in a sense, except to continue harming in order to prove themselves right. Well, we have to somehow allow people the space to say, oh my gosh, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. But when we have people do it, particularly public figures, we further ostracize them as weak and crazy and irreparable. It's like we create a setting that says nobody can ever make a mistake, and that becomes a poisonous setting. Okay, so it's not like there's a single answer for everybody. It's different for each person and how they meet the incident. Are they the perpetrator of harm? If so, they've got to recognize the harm that they have done and learn from it and acknowledge it. And that takes a lot of humility. It takes some vulnerability on their part, but it's a different vulnerability than the one who's been harmed. whose vulnerability has already been attacked and then they've suffered from it. And so they have to figure out, what do I do for my own safety? But another vulnerability in them, potentially, if they say, all right, do I engage with this person? And the engagement can only safely happen after the other one's acknowledged. I think I've done something to harm you. It's like, Benji's friend realizing I cut Benji off years ago. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I have to reach out to him again and say, I'm sure you didn't intend to hurt me. You're presuming that you knew my story. But that's a risk. Those are all very risky. And one of the things that I find really problematic about our lives and our culture today is we don't allow people, we don't create this space for those risks to happen. If people take those risks, they're kind of out there on the edge of a cliff and the howling wind, doing it all by themselves, and everyone's too ready to watch them fall off the cliff. So I think those are the kind of concerns I have. And Marina's been trying to get in here, so I think we ought to.
Oh, no, I'm so interested in what you have to say. I think what you have to say is so helpful. And I agree with the vulnerability point, quite a lot. What I'm thinking also is that there's both a kind of personal vulnerability, you could call it affective, but also an epistemic vulnerability. So, am I able to reframe how I think about things? So, I think the topic of narrative is important because when I'm trying to talk with my students or faculty colleagues about questions of race and listen to them, or if I'm in a reconciliation process with someone, I have to be willing basically to change my story. My story of what I think the problem is, or what I think the right solution is, or even my sense of what I think I understand about someone else's own story, that I might have a lot of my own stuff coming into it. And I think the religious resources are there in mysticism. If we don't think we can get God right by one single image, then surely we shouldn't think that we can get someone else right by one single image and one single story. So I do think that kind of mutual exchange of narrative is important. And an image I found helpful with my students in talking about race in class, like the semester impulse, is, when we have these conversations, we're like new dance partners, we're gonna step on each other's toes at some point, probably. I said, I could, as your professor, say something that's not helpful or constructive and step on your toes. And so what I need you to be able to do is tell me that, and have some mutual forbearance and patience for one another in getting there, so the process is vulnerable and risky, but if we don't embark on it, we'll never get there. I don't hope you don't mind if I offer one more little thing that I found super helpful with my students, which is, it's not a religious resource, but in Greek, in Aristotle, actually, he talks about the difference between pity, compassion, and sunelgein, a word in Aristotle that I'll type into the chat, and I love this. So sunelgein is the ability to feel pain with someone else when you're experiencing the same thing. But sympatheia, Aristotle doesn't make this as clear as he ought to, but is different, right? Because I don't have to be in the same position as you to have sympathy. And I find that a helpful framing device for my students to think about, are we both having the flu together, or are we two students of color who have experienced very, very similar things at the same time, versus do I have a kind of feeling with that respects the difference that my student color is positioned differently than I am. So anyway.
Elizabeth?
I've been doing some reading on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which is truly an amazing process, I think. I knew about it, not much about it, but I've sort of decided that's going to be one of my reads this semester. It seems to me that the construction of the narrative there about the hateful racist acts and policy that was in place for generations in South Africa, the strength of constructing the narrative is that it places the real power in the hands of those who were acted against, who were sinned against. Because part of the agreement, it's a hard agreement, is the oppressors are going to tell the truth, and the people who were oppressed are not necessarily going to cash that check. Indeed, it presupposes they won't cash that check. The telling the narrative in itself is the judgment, and there's not going to be repercussions for telling that narrative, which is a very hard thing, I think, in the United States, because we're a country who likes to think of ourselves as always getting it right. We're God's country, and therefore we're the banner. The United States is the banner bearer of freedom, democracy, yada, 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 and not think of our original sin as racism. That we had an original sin. We had an original falling off that was slavery. So it's very hard, I think, in the current context, to apply the insights of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to a vast and complicated country like the United States, much larger than South Africa, with a history of racism that's actually older than South Africa, and yet agreed that the construction of the narrative is itself beneficial, and that we have to let the people who were sinned against, who were oppressed, do the judging here. That is a very hard thing, I think.
Let me just interject for a second. The speakers next week are both people who've had experience working with the South African context.
Right.
And so that's likely to play a role into the discussion. Elizabeth, you had your hand up.
Yeah, that's wonderful. This was exactly what I was thinking of too, with our American historian Jill Lepore, right, coming out front in the Washington Post and saying America absolutely. I'm not quite sure why she had to get in front of it like that, but I had been thinking that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Rwanda, Good Friday Agreement, right, this is something that in the Australian context, reconciliation is equated with truth telling. So it's very much in line with what Benji was talking about. An empathetic narrative, telling the story of us in a truthful way will hurt, but it's only in that pain can we do something different.
Jim, you wanted to?
Yeah, thanks. This is such a wonderful discussion, and Rabbi Samuelson, I'm so happy that you're with us. I hope you'll come back. I've learned so much from listening to you. I just have two thoughts, and they fit somewhere in the conversation. I won't try to say where. The first is very simple, which is that we're not really talking just, if we were historically aware, we would realize we are not just talking about racism in terms of Black and brown people. These conversations are always overlooking the genocide of the Native Americans. I'm very engaged in justice for Native Americans, and it always amazes me that people have these conversations and they frame them in terms of the so-called original sin against Black people. But frankly, there was a bigger original sin, and that was the stealing of land and labor from the first inhabitants. And the reason we forget them is because we so successfully killed them. I mean, the scholarly consensus is now that that was in fact a genocide. There are only less than 3 million Native Americans left in this country. So we don't live on the plain states. We don't live in the West where they're more populous, but it always troubles me that we simply write them off as being not part of the discussion, and we do it unintentionally. The second thing I wanted to say, though, is more directly related to what we've all been talking about, and that is the process of reconciliation. It seems to me that one of the issues is that it's very hard for two parties to come together in that process, especially if one party still holds all sorts of privilege or all sorts of power. And I think if we're going to be talking about reconciliation, we need to expand the conversation to two other areas. One is, who are the mediators? I think there have to be trusted mediators, and we certainly don't have any in this country. We don't even respect the International Court of Justice. When I think, well, who are the mediators in the American need for reconciliation? The only people who come to mind are the press. But of course, one side has now vilified the press so badly that not even they count as mediators. But it seems to me that successful reconciliation requires a mediator who is, in the original sense of the term, disinterested, whose role is to provide a framework for the conversation which limits the power of the offending party, because usually the offending party has some kind of power that the victim has been robbed of. And the other way to expand the conversation beyond mediators is, I think, to try to frame this conversation in terms of the burgeoning field that we call restorative justice. That the model of restorative justice, I think, adds a new dimension to things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it says there is something that needs to be set right, and simply reframing the narrative may not be enough, especially when there's been loss of health, loss of property, loss of opportunity. That restorative justice looks at a way of enabling both the offender and the victim to move beyond the psychologically perhaps and spiritually satisfying stage of reconciliation to something which is frankly more real.
Marina?
Just very quickly, and embodied. I mean, I think the thing that Sean Copeland's article really reminds me of is it's about, you know, the freedom of bodies, not just principles or narratives, but life and death matters, right? Safety from assault. And so, Jim, I really appreciate your point about power. You know, when the power is over a body, then liberation is not only of principles or ideals, but liberation of the body.
And I want to go back to one of, Eric is, we'll get him in here for the first
Go
time.
ahead, Theresa, no problem. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the starting point there, Jim, in my mind, the connection increasingly between slavery, racism, and colonialism writ large, and how chattel slavery is just all part of that process. And so we're looking back hundreds of years to recognize and potentially right wrongs, if that's, to what degree that's possible. I have come to appreciate that a little bit more personally. A few decades ago, oh gosh, I realize how old I am when I say a few decades ago I learned something. A few decades ago, I learned that my family, on both sides of my family, my father's side and my mother's side, were both here on this continent in the 1600s, both on French. And that one of them on my mother's side, my ancestor Gilles Rageau was sent by Louis XIV to serve as a exchequer for New France, and that the family was given a parcel of land at the confluence of the St. Lawrence River and another river in a community that's now called Sorel-Tracy. And so, you know, as I said, decades ago, I learned that, like, I was so proud. Oh my gosh, I've been here for so long. And more recently realizing, if my family was given land at the confluence of two rivers, chances are there was a Native community that had known that as home, or at least home in transition. And so there was a community that was removed from that land in order for my family to settle there and be there for generations until they started dispersing out in other places. And so the recognition of this is becoming quite personal. I say to myself, what am I going to do about this? What are we as a family going to do about this? And right now I don't have an answer to that. It's just a brand new question. But they're all these issues are connected.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're bringing it back to what I wanted to say earlier, but I didn't want to butt in. And that is that there's I'm sorry, I'm sitting outside because my cleaning person is inside. It's beautiful out here, it's wonderful. There's a difference between reconciliation between individuals, right, and reconciliation between populations. And I guess the populations one is so big, and of course, Mark, you talked about South Africa, right? And then somebody maybe it was you also, who talked about like the big gap between the issues in making anything like that happen here, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it means for community. I mean, what does it mean for us as, are we all white people here today?
Today,
I mean,
yes. Yeah.
what does it mean? What does it mean for us as a population? And we're subpopulation. I mean, we're all different parts of the white population. I had to learn that Benji talked about the discussion that Jewish people have, right? About, are we white? That I have to say, yes, I'm white. I mean, I benefit from all the things that white people benefit from. And when my people came here from the old country, you know, they saw that that was the way to make it. And so they decided they were going to be white, right? So I'm white. So, I mean, what as white people are we to do? Not as individuals, but as white people.
This is one of the places that, for me, the language of reconciliation, the language of vulnerability that came up earlier was striking chords, because the Jewish world has just come out of the season of reconciliation and vulnerability. If I take Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, at its most serious, and it hit very hard this year, it is ultimately about communal vulnerability. I mean, yes, there's a very personal aspect to it of looking internal introspection, but the prayers themselves are all voiced as the community. It's the community standing before God. And as far as I know, that aspect is less present in the Christian liturgical system, where it's individual sin that ends up being addressed. But the Jewish community stands before God once a year, or peaks at once a year, really stands before God daily, but that's a different question, and says, we have problems we need to be addressing, and we need to be addressing them as a community. And the challenge then is, how do you take that motivation and actually concretize it?
Mm-hmm.
But the impetus is there.
I think the impetus is there, and I think, in fact, that that our atonement and what we're supposed to be doing goes beyond reconciliation in one other way, which is that it's not simply about being sorry about something. It's about really, it's about changing behaviors, right? That we specifically, you know, we specifically talk about not repeating it and finding new ways of doing things.
And of creating the reconciliation before turning to God.
Yes, and reconciliation,
level
with people
reconciliation.
before turning to God. Yeah.
As somebody who always talked over Eric at Boise meetings, I think Eric's been wanting to say something for a time. So Eric.
No, I have to run in just a few minutes. I don't know. Do we go to 1:30 or are we normally? I have to leave a little after 1.
We're not going past 1:15 at the very latest.
Okay, I have to leave about 5 minutes past 1. But one of the things also I think that comes along with this is maybe related to Jim's point earlier, was that we also need to learn to share power. One of the greatest issues, you know, I think the big inflection point that we're reaching right now is whether or not this country can sustain itself, can become, I shouldn't say sustain itself, can properly become a multi-ethnic democracy. We've been a white-run country for a long time, and there's a struggle to repress votes and to repress voices and to not allow openness to our corridors of power. And there have been channels into those corridors of power that we've made, you know, some public policies and some educational institutions and some corporations and whatever that have created little tunnels. But the walls are still present in formal and informal ways. And in the end, what I think is going to be a symbol of whether it's reconciliation or simply ability to live together, which might allow some form of reconciliation, is shared power. And that will mean, you know, non-white people in charge of, or at least politically represented in the real ways in which non-white people exist in this country and have contributed to this project for hundreds of years. And the fear behind that and the structures and inertia that prevents that, I think, is sort of our work for the generation in terms of the political work that comes alongside the reconciliation and the empathy and the working it out. But in the end, those things, the empathy and the reconciliation, might be worked out after the power is redistributed in meaningful ways, and maybe not, you know, not forcibly, but by open processes, by opening our processes more. for leadership and voices and recognition and things in new ways.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
So just to draw upon all those comments, I think for me, again, I'm not Muslim. I study Islam and gender, but the concept that comes to me so much then is Tawheed, which is the indivisible oneness concept of monotheism that clearly all of these, the Christian, the Jewish, the Al-Kitab, people of the book, share. So whether it's unity in Christ or Catholic with a lowercase c, I don't know what the concept is in Judaism. I mean, I think this is what we would all be making claim to if we were to come to the truth and reconcile that we are all one people under God, no matter what the superficial differences arguably may be.
Yeah, I think at some level we have to be careful how we frame that, in the sense that it's from within our own perspectives that we are understanding all humanity that way, recognizing that, of course, all of humanity and all of Americans even are not Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So that complicates that a little bit. But yes.
Well, I think the other thing that complicates that is that same idea of inclusivity and justice not being the same thing, right? Recognizing that we're all one people and making it so, right, are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things that calls my attention in this is paying attention to the diversity within the community. That, so as I think about the Christian community or the Catholic community in particular, it itself is a diversified world. And I'm challenged to discover in myself and my own settings, how is it that the non-white voices, or where is it that the non-white voices have been allowed to be, and where have they not been allowed to be and take leadership, and or at least even just have their experience known beyond the boundaries of maybe their subgroup. So
I think in the Catholic community, this is something that we dealt with all the time with the STM when I was over there. Whether we like it or not, Anglo-Catholics are not going to be in charge in the very near future, because the vast majority of practicing Catholics are going to be brown Catholics, some form of Hispanics Catholics, and in the church, we still very much have a hybernarchy. It's largely white Irish people that are still in charge, and that's about to end very suddenly. It's ending already, but it's going to come down with a crash. And so whether we like it or not, we're going to have to figure out how to do that, to share power with groups that in fact have been marginalized in the past. And my suspicion is that eventually all of the United States will be like California, where there is no racial majority, and better that we talk about this now and work this out than wait for the whole ceiling to come crashing in when white people is like, oh, wait a minute, we're not in. It's like what happened to white Protestants after World War I. Like, oh, wait, who are all these Catholics and Jews that are speaking for the culture? Like, where did they come from? The Protestants are no longer speaking for the whole culture. Well, that was a big crisis, In fact, in my field in American religion, 1919 to 1925 is called the Great Reversal, when Protestants for the first time realized they were not the spokespersons for the culture single-handedly. And that was a big cultural crisis. So I think it behooves us to prepare ourselves for that, because it's going to happen,
I'm conscious of the time and conscious that we've already had two people who've had to leave. So maybe we'll turn to Theresa and Benjamin for some concluding thoughts, and then we'll wrap this up. So Theresa, maybe you first this time.
I've appreciated the conversation, and it's been interesting and instructive. Thank you very much for your contributions and your thoughts. I think the thing that I'm finding the challenging part to kind of think about and listen to is how do we prepare for a structural or communal reconciliation, that Janet brought up. How is the communal aspect of it going to be different? And the thing that catches my attention, I think is very much a reality here in the United States now, is that when you say communal, in some ways it presumes the community. Well, we all agree now, and it's like, oh my gosh, white Americans do not agree largely about lots of things, and race in particular. And while some will go along and be really happy with whatever advances we make, others are going to be kicking and screaming and clawing their way back to some what I would consider a more regressive place. And I have to be mindful of how do we attend to the whole community in that. And I don't have an answer for that. I'm just saying you can't just say, well, let's the progressive more end of things move forward and, you know, to hell with the rest of them. It's just, that's not a workable answer. Ben?
Yeah, so I'll share my thoughts because I've learned so much from all of us and all of you in this conversation. My mind is going to, in the framework that I've been thinking about this, how do we bridge what before I called kind of racial consideration through the lens of inclusivity and through the lens of justice. And when we were speaking about truth and reconciliation, I was thinking about what truth needs to be articulated before we achieve reconciliation. And I know, just wearing my rabbinical hat, right? When there's deep family fissures, what people need to hear is not, I stole $10,000 from the family estate or misappropriated something. Right? What people need is they need to hear, I betrayed your trust. I betrayed the relationship. And people much more easily could say, I took money. I didn't mean anything bad by it. I didn't think it was wrong. Right? But people don't articulate the real truth there of the deep betrayal. And it's so complex, like who gets to be the representative for injustices perpetrated in history before long ago. It's the other side of the radical empathy coin, right? Mm-hmm. Justice is about remedying the hurts, but some of those hurts are so deep and aren't about a check or an opportunity, even though as important as those are in the real world. And so, I think there has to be, and this is a role perhaps that those of us who study religion can say religion has a place here, is that the affirmative lens of inclusivity could perhaps lead us to what needs to be articulated as a prelude to justice. Of what are our fundamental values, what dignities do people deserve, how have those dignities been betrayed, and then we could translate it into the injustices in wealth inequities and education and healthcare and housing and the like. So that's just what I'm thinking about, but this has been very helpful to me to further and deepen my own thoughts. And and at the very least, I think just the affirmative value that Boston College faculty are engaging in these considerations is also uplifting.
Thank you very much. Next week, exactly on next Tuesday, we are going to have two other panelists, one from BC's Faith, Peace, and Justice minor, Professor Joshua Snyder, and Yavila McCoy, who is a member of the Jewish community in Boston and director of Dimensions Educational Consulting, which directs its work to issues of racial equity. And she's also very involved in working with Jews of color as one of her central things. She's actually one of the people who has brought the whole conversation and been an immense resource for our entire conversation at the Congregation Shaarei Tefillah as well. So really look forward to being able to welcome her. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you to Theresa and to Benji for their stimulating us into thinking more deeply about this and adding to our thoughts. And look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Ruth, for putting this together. It was excellent.
Yes, thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.
Take care, everybody.
Can I say one more thing in response to Benji? I think you're right in terms of, you know, what part of what religion can do, but I think don't forget to bring the radical empathy piece in at the same time, because I think that we've got to be reading things like what Theresa had us read. I mean, because we've got to be understanding the anger. We've got to be understanding the anger. We've got to be understanding that the sense of betrayal. I mean, and how deep it is.
No. And religious traditions, despite their resources, have something to apologize and to give truthful articulation for.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. So I think it's the combination of those two things that you know, what you said earlier, and this empathy and the things that we have to be sorry about as different religions. Yeah, religious population.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great.